it's now 15 years since Ajahn Chah passed away, and unlike many of his contemporaries and great teachers in Thailand, it's noticeable that the monasteries associated with Wat Bapong, his monastery, continue to grow, and the number of monks and nuns who consider themselves his disciples continue to grow both in Thailand and overseas. And his influence generally is felt throughout the Buddhist world, probably with the Dalai Lama and Mutit Nhat Hanh and one or two others. He's probably the most well-known Buddhist teacher. So there's a lot of interest these days in Ajahn Chah. Very few people know about his background and his life. Most of the people who met him in the West did so on his two visits to England and America in the 70s. But very few people know about his early life. So I thought today would be interesting to talk and tell you a little bit about his youth, his childhood, his youth, his early life as a novice and as a young monk, and the years leading up to the establishment of his monastery, Wat Bapong.
Would Prajan say something about Ajahn Chah's early days?
Yes, let's start off with his birth, which, as you know, took place in a little village in Ubon province in northeast Thailand on 17th of June 1918. Now, Ubon is the province which adjoins the Mekong River to the east, which separates it from Laos, and to the south, just about 100 kilometers away, we reach northern Cambodia. So it's in that corner of northeast Thailand. And Ubon, and indeed all of northeast Thailand, has been ethnically, we say Lao rather than Thai, Lao-speaking people, and so the culture and the society there is somewhat different from we find in central Thailand, although these days the difference is not so apparent because of the modernization of the country. In those days it was almost like a different country. And the Ubon is a very, at least that part of Ubon, is very flat. The river Moon flows through Ubon province on its way to the Mekong River in the east, and the city of Ubon is situated on the banks of the Moon River. And then the village of Bangor is a few kilometers to the south. At the time when Ajahn Chah was born, it was still a very thickly forested area, generally speaking. There were small clearings which the villages were situated. And the village that Ajahn Chah was born was called Bangor. And he was born into quite a wealthy family, according to the standards of the village of that time, not of course by our present day standards. But the family had, for instance, some cattle and had tobacco fields, and was reasonably well off. Ajahn Chah was the fifth of 11 children, which was a normal amount of children to have in those days, because even until recently, in countries with no social security safety net and the high infant mortality, then parents would want to have lots of children because probably they would lose some, and also to support them in their old age, apart from the fact that people just love having children anyway. So he was the fifth child. His personality as a young boy, he was very outgoing, effervescent, good-humoured, ebullient. He liked a good laugh, he liked to play, and he things that people remember was that he was, although he was quite strong boy and playful, he was never violent and very good-natured. And one thing that he remembers himself in his childhood was that when they used to play games, his favourite game was dressing up as a monk. And he said that he would have a piece of cloth and sort of put over his shoulder, and then his friend and brothers and sisters would bring some food, and then he would take it like the monk takes a formal offering of food, and then he'd give a blessing for them. And so when I was a kid, we'd play cowboys and Indians and things like that. But he'd play monks and lay people. And physically, he had quite a round face. And something you may notice in photographs is that one of his ears was bigger than the other one. His right ear is bigger than his left ear. And he had this sort of the Lao people often have what they call lion's nose, not sort of long like mine, sort of flat nose, and also very wide mouth. I don't know if you noticed, unusually wide mouth. Those were the things. And when he was older, his brother once said, you couldn't say that Ajahn Chah was handsome, but when you were with him, you couldn't take your eyes off him. They had a completely magnetic presence. So anyway, he began his schooling at the age of 8, and in those days, these were the early days of state education. For hundreds of years, the monasteries have been the main source of education, although only for the boys, so it wasn't very fair that way. But they gave a good education, and from the statistics figures I've seen, the standard of literacy amongst Thai boys in the 19th century was much higher than you would find in the Western countries. So they would get both an academic and a moral education. That changed in the late 19th century with the modernization of the country under the fifth king. And although many of the schools that were established in that first phase of state education were on land donated by the monasteries, and so the monks were still close by and would often teach in the schools. But in those days there were three years of primary education as a standard, but then that was not compulsory. You expected to do 1 year minimum, and that's what he did. He did 1 year, and then at the age of 9, he went to live in the monastery, and he became what we call a dek wat. So you may think, well, that's a strange thing for a boisterous young boy to want to do, but
you mean that it's only him staying in the temple, or with his brother or sister?
I don't think any of his brothers were in the temple.
Just only him.
Yeah, but firstly, let's talk a little bit about monasteries, because in the West, people have ideas of monasteries as kind of far away and maybe with a big wall around it and very secluded and difficult to get in and get out, whereas the monasteries in the villages were right in the centre of the village, and people would be walking through, and often say the monastery well would be used by people for their water supply. And then the monasteries were just the sort of the heart of the village. They'd be like a hostel. If somebody was travelling through, they'd spend the night at the monastery. They're like the hospital. They're the social centre. If there were any sort of ceremonies or music, festivals, everything take place in the monastery. Was the intellectual centre of the monastery. Also, many of the monks would have various skills. They were craftsmen of various kinds. The monastery also had the spiritual authority in the village, and they would be consulted by the head man of the village and any important developments, things happening in the village. So going to live in the monastery wasn't sort of going a long way from home. It was just probably just a 2 or 3 minute walk, and his mum would be coming, and all brothers and sisters coming in. It's just he said that he had some kind of a pull towards monastic monasteries from when he was a child, and he said maybe that was because of influence of past lives. He doesn't really know, but he did feel this real interest to take on the monastic education and to be living in a monastery with the monks. On another occasion, he said, more as a joke, that he just got fed up having to do all the work in the house, because it was his job, not as much in the house, outside the house, because it was his job to water all the tobacco plants, and you have to sort of haul the water from the well and carry the water, and so he thought he'd just get away from that. I don't know how serious he was, but there was another incident just before he went to the monastery, where the whole family were working together pounding rice, and there was an accident, and the mallet hit his head, and he got very angry, and he said, "That's it, I've had enough, I'm going to the monastery." But anyway, he in the monastery altogether for some 4 years, and during that time he would look after the monks and do various chores and service for the monks, but he would also be studying and learning Thai language and learning the Dhamma language in which the scriptures were written in, and so on. So after Ajahn Chah had been living in the monastery for 4 years as a Dekwat, at the age of 13 he became a novice. So there is a lower age limit before you can become a novice. In fact, in the text, it says that a boy should be old enough to be able to scare crows away. So he was definitely old enough to do that, and he became a novice. And so, wearing the robe now, there was a bit more expected of him in terms of his general deportment and study of the text, learning all the chanting that the monks had to do for the morning and evening services, and then for ceremonies, maybe going to take meal in somebody's house and having to chant the Paritta blessings and so on and so forth. And he had there was one monk in the monastery called Ajahn Lang, who was his mentor and his kind of teacher, and he was very close to him and looked after him. And when he used to go back to visit his home every now and again, Ajahn Lang would go along with him. And then when he was 16, which is kind of difficult age if you're living in a monastery in a young adolescent, Ajahn Lang one day said, "Look, why don't we disrobe? Why don't we leave? I think this is good enough." And so whether or not he would have stayed on otherwise, we don't know, but when your teacher encourages you to disrobe and say okay. And it turned out that Ajahn Lang had fallen in love with Ajahn Chah's sister, and that was why he wanted to disrobe. I guess he would have been embarrassed if he disrobed and married Ajahn Chah's sister, and Ajahn Chah stayed in the monastery. So, they both disrobed. So then he didn't. It was okay, and he went to work helping his family, working in the rice fields and so on. And then getting a bit older, and they'd often go off to these festivals or ngans, and you can see already it's kind of tough. They would work all day in the fields with the buffaloes and so on, and planting rice and all those jobs, very kind of tough, hard work. And then in the evening they maybe walk 8, 9, 10 kilometers to another village for a ngan, stay there till late at night, walk all the way back, and then go to work again the next day. So then he was about I think 19, and he fell in love with a young girl, and she was the stepsister of his best friend called Put, and he and she pretty well decided that they would get married. But first of all, he had to do his national service, or at least expected to. There was you would take a in the sense, if you got the wrong colour or the right colour, you go in the army, and then after he'd done his national service, he would he decided to become a monk for a few months, and then they get married. Now, fortunately maybe, firstly he didn't have to go in the army. But then he was walking through the fields one day, and he met his friend Put, and Put said, "I'm taking the lady," and what he meant was he was going to marry Jai, the young girl himself. Now, how this came about was that, as you know, Thailand's very unusual or almost unique in that there's not a dowry paid by the wife's family to the husband's family, but there's what's called a bride price, where the husband's family pay the woman's family, which is one of the reasons why women have always had a lot more stable and respected position in Thai society than in most of the other societies around. And anyway, because they were in some way related, step-related anyway, the family felt that if they married, that would keep the money within the family. And then it was also, they also had a piece of land that they wanted to cultivate, and so the idea was to marry, they would take on this piece of land. And so, as you know, in those days, even to a certain extent, these days in Thailand, the parents' wishes take precedence over the child's wishes, and so they married. And Ajahn Chah was very upset, but he wasn't angry with his friend, because he knew that that's the way things work, and it was their family's decision. And it wasn't like his friend went behind his back and stole his girl or something like that. But he did confess many years later that the first 7 years he was a monk, he still thought about her, and who knows if his friend had died or they separated, he might. So anyway, he used to say he's really his friend Put, who became a disciple of his in later years, and go to the monastery almost every day, and he would point him out to the monks. He'd say, if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here today. So then, after some time, Ajahn Chah started to think about life and what he wanted to do in his life, and realized what he really wanted to do was to become a monk, not just the customary short period of 3 months, which most young Thai men would take on as a way of showing their gratitude to their parents for the way they've been brought up. The idea of becoming a monk and then sharing the merit with parents is a very strong part of Thai culture for so long. He decided he wanted to become a monk for an unlimited period. So he went back to the monastery, the local monastery, and then on the 26th of April in 1939 he became a monk. And initially he stayed at the monastery at Mangor. He was very interested in studying and doing the basic academic course, which is called Naktam. So the first year or so he was studying a Naktam tree, and then he wanted to carry on further, and there wasn't really anyone who could teach him at his local monastery. so after a couple of years, he went to another monastery about 40 or 50 kilometers to the east in Pibun, Wat Suan Sawan, and spent the Pansa, the rains retreat there, studying. That was like 1941. So there was a very difficult period because there was the Second World War. The Japanese were based in Thailand then, and there was, in fact, Ubon was, as you probably know, was bombed during the Second World War by the French. So it was wartime, and for monks that meant that the requisites, the cloth, the robes and food were very, very sparse, kind of difficult for monks as well, because the lay people themselves were struggling. And from there he, still looking for teachers and people who could help him in his academic studies, he went up to Kuang Nai, which is north of Ubon, and found a very good monastic school there and a good teacher, and spent some time there. By this time he was becoming more and more determined that he was going to spend his whole life as a monk. And he'd see his friends who would spend some time and then disrobe. You see, sometimes they'd be all prepared to disrobe, and they'd put their trousers on and so on, and try them out in the monastery, and sort of all ready to go. And he'd think how stupid they were to give up the monk's life. But he said, I didn't dare say anything because I couldn't really be sure that how strong my own resolution was. Then something happened which really had a big effect on him, and that was the illness and death of his father. And that took place at the end of 1943. In fact, it was about the time for his exams, his monastic, but he gave those up and went to nurse his father for the last few weeks of his illness until he died. And of course, the death of a father for anyone is a major shock, and makes most people question their mortality and the meaning of their life, and more particularly for a monk, there's someone who's already spending a lot of time thinking about life and trying to develop good qualities in themselves. And this was when he really started to meditate. Now, I think for many people in the West, they just think being a monk means that you're a full-time meditator. But of course, many monks don't meditate, and certainly in the village monasteries, it was not a usual thing to do, or something that was necessarily part of their lifestyle, except for maybe just a short period in the morning and the evening. But this was when he became really interested in meditating and really living the life of a monk more fully than he'd been doing before. And he started to meditate, and he found it very difficult. So it's something to remember. Even someone like Ajahn Chah started off, and it was not easy. And he said a lot of it was food. He was really into food, and he'd be meditating, then he'd have visions of all these delicious foods, and sometimes he'd say it was like he could just feel all the saliva in his mouth, and so that was one of his major problems. But this was when he really, I think, first fully made that adhitān, that vow, that determination to become enlightened in this lifetime. When you become a monk in the ceremony of entrance or upasampada, that's part of the ceremony. You declare this determination. But for many people, it's just a phrase. But this was when he really made that determination that come what may, he was going to put his life on the line. He was going to put everything into it. He was going to give it his best shot, to the very best he could. and so where you begin to see this incredible kind of determination that he had. You know, very single-minded. When he decided to do something, he'd really go for it. So he was also studying the monk's discipline a lot. This was another part of his personality and his character, very noticeable, particularly in the early days. He was very interested in the monk's discipline and the sila of a monk, and he was starting to study the more advanced textbooks. And one is the Visuddhimagga, which is one of the great commentary on the Buddha's teachings that was written down in Sri Lanka some 1,500 years ago. And then the Pubbasika, which is the kind of Bible of the forest monks in many ways, in that it's a commentary written by a monk in the 19th century based on old Sri Lankan texts, and it's extremely detailed, complex, and it was the book that was used by him to teach his own disciples in future times. So he spent a lot of time in very detailed study of the monk's discipline, apart from his growing interest in meditation.
Was it mostly self-study, or was he, taught by any particular Ajahn?
At this period, it was mostly self-study. I mean, the academic teachings generally, as I say, in the monastery in Kuang Nai, he found a good teacher there. So he was receiving some input, but basically self-study, I think.
But the text is in
Thai.
In Thai.
Yes. Although the language in the text is very dry and very difficult. You know, most monasteries, when the Ajahns read this out in the evening, all the monks are sort of like nodding off. It was really boring. But he was fascinated. He loved that.
But Ajahn, this must have been already quite a few years that he spent doing this academic study.
Yeah.
Did this contribute to his practice in any way?
Well, of course, one of the important duties of a young monk in the first 5 years particularly is what is called by the Buddha straightening out your views, or developing samadhi, right view, or a clear and correct understanding of the theory of the Buddha's teachings. And so he was absorbing that and sort of integrating it into his whole way of looking at his life and looking at the world. So, in later years when he was teaching, then although he'd speak in a very down-to-earth, natural style, not at all academic, if you know the theory behind it, you can pick it. Oh yes, he's talking about this, he's talking about that. He's just not using all the technical terms that you would come across in those books, but he's so completely digested it that it's just part of his way of talking. So he went back to his old monastery in 1944 and spent another couple of years there, and towards the end he was actually teaching the young monks and novices. But he was becoming more and more frustrated and feeling that he really it was the meditation and the Vinaya study that were really his inspiration, and he felt kind of stagnation in a small village monastery, no real sort of stimulating environment, no real challenge to him. And so at the end of 1945, that cold season, beginning of 1946, then he left his monastery and set off on a tudong. So I was telling you how at the beginning of 1946, Ajahn Chah left the village monastery at Bangkok and set off to walk to central Thailand, a few hundred kilometers away. So this was like almost a second leaving home for him. And it was the point at which he can say he became a tudong monk, or a forest monk, for the first time. So maybe I could give you a bit of background on that. Right from the time of the Buddha himself, monks were already tending to form into two groups. One group of monks would live in the forests, quite secluded from lay people, and would devote themselves primarily to meditation practice, developing the threefold training leading to enlightenment. But there are also many monks, for one reason or another, who would live a lot closer to the towns and the villages, and they would have much more interaction with the lay people, and would be teaching and advising and so on and so forth. Sometimes it may well have been because they were ill and they couldn't handle the life in the forest. Maybe they had forest fevers and malaria and so on. It was too dangerous for them to be in the deep forest. Or else maybe as they got older, the life in the forest was too harsh for them. There may be many different reasons for it. It may well have been that, speaking from experience these days, that maybe parents of monks were very ill and they wanted to be close to their family and to be able to give moral, spiritual support to them. So there are all kinds of reasons why this kind of division between the monks originated. And over the course of hundreds of years, thousands of years now, it's become a very kind of clear-cut distinction. And the monks who live in the monasteries, like the one I told you about before, right in the middle of the towns and the villages, tend to be devoted a lot more to academic study and to, we could say, priestly duties and interaction with the lay people, performing ceremonies and so on and so forth. Whereas the forest monasteries and the forest monks, usually in a minority, are living a little bit further away, a little bit more secluded, less contact with the lay people. Now, having said that, it's important to realize that the way the Buddha set up the monastic order ensured that monks have to have at least a daily, minimal daily contact with lay people. He didn't want the monks to be hermits. And there are all kinds of rules that prevent monks from going off by themselves for weeks or months on end and completely turning their backs on society. The Buddha didn't want monks to do that. So the forest monks have to go on alms round every day to walk into the local village and to receive their food, daily food offering. And so in the villages, one of the first things people do in the morning, they wake up and they cook some rice, and then they go and stand outside the house and wait for the monks to come and have a chat, and often they take their children or their grandchildren, and so it's a very beautiful way to start the day with an act of offering. And people in the northeast would often just put a small lump of sticky rice in the monk's bowl. So even the poorest person could offer something and feel they were contributing to the daily life of the monk and to support the monastery. And the sight of the monks and their restraint and their peaceful demeanour would be inspiring to the people and remind them of their religious, spiritual aspirations. So it was very uplifting for the lay people, and of course not at all burdensome on them, just a small amount of rice and maybe a banana or some chili sauce or something like that, because the monks, forest monks, only eat one meal a day at about 8 in the morning. So they would only come just one time a day, so not bothering the lay people a lot and being a burden on them. But the monks receive the food, and they can't keep food overnight, which means you can only take what you can eat, and then you have to give the rest away. So the lay people will come into the monastery to help offer food or whatever, and then the food remaining from the monks, what they didn't eat, would be returned to the lay supporters. And so monks are not allowed to take a large amount of food and just go off into a cave or a mountain, and monks are not allowed to cook their own food. They're not allowed to dig the earth. They're not allowed to grow food themselves. Not even allowed to pick fruit off a tree. So the monks are completely helpless that way. That they're forced to have that kind of relationship with the lay people. So my point is that even though the forest monks were very much more secluded and not so much everyday contact with the lay people, then there is still inevitably some contact. And lay people would on the one prat day, like the half moon and the full moon, would often go to visit the monastery, and the senior monk would give a Dhamma talk and some instruction, advice. So the life of the forest monk, I say, quite different from the life of the monks in the village monasteries. One important difference is that the forest monks would take the rules of discipline very much more seriously, let's say, and one important rule is the rule about not touching money, because that means that it ensures that a monk doesn't have any power to do things that he wants to do, or to, some monks say, well, it makes everything so inconvenient if you don't even have a small amount of money, but that's exactly the point. It is meant to make monks inconvenient. It's a real training in itself. So that's just an overall kind of idea of the difference in lifestyle between the monks in the forest and the monks in the village monasteries. So Ajahn Chah for 7 years had been living in the village monasteries mainly, and now becoming a forest monk, he went on what we call tudong. Now this is a term we don't really have a good equivalent for in English, and most of us we just use this Thai word, which in fact is derived from a Pali word which means dutanga. Now actually the word dutanga means an ascetic practice, literally something that sort of rubs away through friction the defilements. So it's a kind of a series of extra sort of voluntary practices which monks take on to go against the grain, and just to kind of intensify their practice somewhat. And monks can take on particular ascetic practices or tudonga practices or tudong practices for a short period, and may just take on 1 or 2 or 3 of these practices, which are 13 in number, for a short period of time, or to deal with some particular difficulty in their practice. But this word has been adapted for the practice of forest monks to go walking through the forest, through jungle areas, because particularly in the old days, that kind of walk was in itself inevitably difficult, tough, and one which you'd have to go against the grain a lot. For instance, the alms round that I mentioned, if you're going to the same village every day, your local village, and everyone in the villages looks on you, you're their monks, if you like. The monastery is sort of part of their responsibility. It's something they're happy to look after, and the people are waiting for you every morning. It's more like a ceremony. It's something in exchange with the people that you know every morning. But when you're walking particularly walking a long way in an area that you've never been before, you have to always try to be within walking distance of a village when you rest at night, and then you walk into the village, and quite often, because the people not knowing that you're coming, they haven't prepared anything, and you may not get anything at all, or you may get very little. So there's that kind of uncertainty every day. I've been walking, say, 20, 30, 40, 50 kilometers, I haven't eaten for 24 hours. Mm-hmm. Now I'm walking into this village. Am I going to get anything to eat or not? Mm-hmm. And you don't really know. Quite often you would just get just a few mouthfuls of rice. So that's already quite a challenge. Of course, you're not allowed to carry food with you, remember. You're not even allowed like salt and pepper or fish sauce or something. You just have to make do. The walking itself is in those days, of course, not really many roads, and they're mostly tracks, cart tracks, and thick forest, meaning malaria, lots of fevers around, and the wild animals. In those days, there's still a lot of tigers and wild bears and elephants, and then of course all the poisonous snakes and centipedes and so on. So a Tudong monk would use his glot. So this is the glot. Shall I? I'll just see. So the monks make these themselves. This is a modern one. So in those days this was made of cloth rather than this waterproof. And you can see. So this is one of the things that monks learn to do. They learn how to make these bamboo struts, and then to sew them together. This would be this is aluminium now. An old one would just be of wood. And so this has got you can see a hook on the top. So you string a line up between two trees, and then you hang that from the hook, and then you have a mosquito net. Again, this would be cloth in those days, just ordinary cotton cloth. And so you're in the middle of the forest, but you have your own little portable tent, as it were. But you're on the forest floor. Maybe you just have a piece of cloth. So any kind of snakes or centipedes or anything, then they're not going to be bothered about coming in. Although some monks, there's one great teacher who just passed away a few years ago, not Ajahn Chah, and one of his disciples was saying he had the ability to hypnotize ants so that they wouldn't come into his area. I can't do that for sure. So this was how monks would live in the forest. So some would protect them from rain if they brought it right down. But also the bowls the monks had were very heavy iron bowls, and it's a lot of trouble to look after these bowls because they'd often get rusty, and then you have to fire them. But these bowls were so large that you could put all your cloth, because the monks would just have this robe, which is called a jiwon, and then a sabong, like a skirt, and then the 2-layer sangati, the one that goes on the shoulder, which is like a blanket also. And you could put these all in the bowl, so if it rained, then nothing would get wet, and you could just take it all out afterwards. So you'd have your grot on one shoulder, and a water bottle, and then you'd have your yam. This is a bag with just general kind of requisites, and then your bowl bag and your bowl on the shoulder, and you'd be walking along like this. And often the monks would walk bare feet, just because there weren't really shoes available, rather than because it was their own choice.
So, what happened if forest monks are deep in the forest and they find a nice, suitable place for meditation or for practice? What are they required to come out all the way to get food from the villages?
Yeah, sure. Except if often it can happen that you just find such a beautiful place, you just decide, I'm just going to stay here for a couple of days and just not eat, just to fast for a couple of days. But you can fast for maybe a week or so, but then you usually need to go somewhere for food. But of course you need water. I mean, you can't do without water. So you need to be near a stream. But generally speaking, a monk would find a place within like 4, 5, 6, 7 kilometers of a village. Of course, again, going back to the time when Ajahn Chah was walking, there were no maps available there. So I mean, I've been on Tudong, and most monks these days you have a basic idea, or there's a village here and a village there, try to get to that village before tomorrow morning or something. But then they didn't know if there were villages or not, you know. Or maybe they could ask, but then you're not always meeting some people. But then a village maybe would just be a hamlet of 2 or 3 houses in a clearing, because Isan was very sparsely populated in those days. And so there was a very thick forest called Dong Payayen, which was a lot of fevers and difficult. So yeah, give you just some idea of the difficulties of it. So with the walking itself, the living on alms round, eating 1 meal a day, and maybe not always getting all you need to eat, and then dangers from wild animals and so on. So it is tudong in the sense that it's going against the grain, forcing you to do things that maybe you wouldn't normally enjoy doing. But having said that, I mean, it's a wonderful experience, tudong. The monks, we love going on tudong, and I mean, the big grumble these days is that so much of the forest has disappeared that it's hard to find areas in Thailand where you can go on those long walks and in the same way or without meeting a lot of people. And so Ajahn Chah and his friend walked westwards towards central Thailand, leaving the northeast and the Lao ethnic provinces, and headed for Lopburi. Now, the reason why he decided to walk all that way is that he didn't know there are any good forest teachers, forest monks, Ajahns in Ubon. Now that may, in fact, there were a few that I found out afterwards, but again, there was just no way of finding out in those days, where the good monks were, and especially the forest monks who tend to be very quiet and obtrusive. I think that he probably heard about the monastery where he decided to go, and its Ajahn, it was called Lumpu Pao, from a Tudong monk, I would imagine. Because just near Ajahn Chah's village there was a big forest called Bapong, about 4 or 5 kilometers away, separated from his village by some rice fields and so on. And every now and again Tudong monks passing through that area would tend to stay in that forest. So there would be this kind of shared information amongst Tudong monks. So if you're going through that area, there's a really good place to stay there, and the lay people are very supportive and so on. And Bapong was a favourite place to go. When Ajahn Chah was a child, he'd been to Bapong forest. That was the first time he saw a Tudong monk. His father had heard that there was a couple of Tudong monks in the forest, and so they took some food in the morning to offer. And that was the first time he'd seen the monks eat in these big bowls on the ground, because before that he'd only seen monks just eating out of plates. Because this is another difference. The forest monks take the standard of eating in one vessel one time a day, whereas the village monks usually eat twice and just eat normally off of plates. So that had fascinated him. Also, he said that that time when he went as a boy, the monk gave a talk, and it was just totally unlike any of the sermons he'd heard in the village monasteries. His dad said, that's not a proper discourse, that's not a sermon, he's just talking. But that was the first time he met a forest monk who had this very natural way of talking that we associate with Ajahn Chah and forest monks. So I assume, and again I don't have evidence for this, that there must have been a forest monk or two coming through his village monastery or close and he'd heard about Lumpur Pao and this monastery in Lopburi from him. Otherwise, it's hard to work out why he should think to walk hundreds of kilometers away. He must have had some information, obviously. So after this long walk, he eventually got to Lopburi and to Wat Kawangkot, and found out that the abbot had died just a few months before. But by that time, it was approaching the annual rains retreat. That's the 3 months from the full moon of July till the full moon of October, in which monks must stay in one particular place. They're not allowed for travelling. And so he decided to spend the rains retreat of 1946 in that monastery. So 1946 was the first year that Ajahn Chah spent as a forest monk in the forest monastery at Kawangkot in Lopburi province in central Thailand. And although Lumpur Pao had passed away before he arrived, a lot of his teachings were recorded, not recorded, but had been written down and they could be studied. And there was a very inspiring monk there. He was Cambodian, but he was unusual in a way, in that he was very skilled in and knowledgeable in the suttas and the academic theoretical side of Buddhism, but also in the practice of meditation. Now, I've been telling you this distinction between the forest monks and the village or the town monks, and unfortunately in Thailand, what's tended to develop is that the forest monks have often neglected the theoretical study, and then the academic monks don't meditate. And so this was the first time he met someone who had this kind of all-round ability and knowledge. And I told you also that Ajahn Chah was very interested in the monk's discipline, and he would often go and speak with this monk and ask questions about more difficult points of the Vinaya discipline. And so in the evening, Ajahn Chah, after the evening service, would walk up onto the top of the mountain, and he liked to do walking meditation up there. It was very quiet and breezy. So it was late at night, and he was walking up and down, when he heard the sound of someone coming up the mountain. Of course, in those days, people didn't have torches, and so he was sort of stumbling up in the darkness and quite dangerous. And who could that be? And it was the Ajahn, the Cambodian Ajahn. And so he said, what brings you up here this time of night? Quite surprised. And the Ajahn said, when you asked me that question today, I gave you a wrong answer. And I just don't want you to have that misunderstanding overnight, because who knows what could happen. Either one of us could die, anything could happen, and it would be terrible, if you were to die or something, were to carry this away with you and never to have it. Ajahn Chah was just so impressed that he had that kind of scrupulousness and that kind of, gave that kind of importance. Also that, he had that sense of the uncertainty of our life and how we can't take anything for granted, and that he would walk all the way up the mountain. It was, he was so sincere about it, and this was so he would tell his monks about this very frequently, as it gave him as a good example of the kind of attitude towards study and the responsibilities of a teacher as well. So one other thing that happened during that Pansa was he had this experience with the Pi'am. Do you know what Pi'am are? Pi'am. Have you ever had Pi'am experience?
No, never.
Really? Okay. Well, Pi'am, Pi, as you know, means ghost. But I think Pi'am is kind of like special kind of experience. Many people have it. And I think if you lay on your back sometimes, maybe it's indigestion, maybe it is some kind of Pi, but I've had this experience. You just have this feeling of this heavy weight weighing down on your chest so you can hardly breathe. But it's not just like a physical thing. You have this sense of like evil and like something really nasty, and it's pushing you down. It's very frightening. And so Ajahn Chah had one of these experiences. Now, before that, he, like many monks, would have all these kind of spells, and he'd learn all these special phrases which are supposed to protect you from all kinds of spirits and things. But this was he had this experience, but then he found that for the first time, instead of thinking of all his spells and things, he just thought of like Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, and just fought with his fear, and until the experience passed away. And so that was also important to him, and in really strengthening his faith in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. Where you don't have to have all these kind of spells; just try to recollect the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And of course, for myself and many of my friends, when we've had this experience, we just got our Ajahn Chah picture. And I always said, well, like Ajahn Chah picture, and just hold it like this. So, not quite sure, what these things are. Okay, the other important thing that happened to him during this Pansa was that he got talking to a layman who was living in the monastery and wearing white and serving the monks and practicing as a lay meditator. And this monk started to tell him about a great teacher in the northeast, now living up in Sakonnakhon, which is in the northern part of the northeastern region, a few hundred kilometers north of Ajahn Chah's hometown. And his name was Lumpu Man. Okay, so everybody knows that name now. He's the great figure in 20th century forest monasticism in Thailand. And we don't have many historical records in Thailand for a number of reasons. One reason is that in 1767 or whenever it was that the Burmese destroyed Ayutthaya, then all the historical records that have been kept for hundreds of years were all burnt and destroyed. But the forest monastic order, just by its very nature, has not lent itself to record keeping and biographies and in the old days. So we really don't know much at all about the forest monks, the Tudong monks, before the late 19th century. There are a few reports of or accounts of monks living on the outskirts of Bangkok in Bang Khun Tien, so like where Runarung School is, and these places, and of monks going up to Wat Saket to watch to contemplate the bodies being taken apart by the birds there and so forth. But generally we don't really know about the forest tradition at all. So it suddenly sort of bursts into the history books with Ajahn Chah and his teacher Ajahn Sao. And so maybe give you a bit of background about Ajahn Mun and Ajahn Sao, because he has a very important influence on Ajahn Chah and his life subsequently. So although the forest tradition, I think, has always been present in Thailand, its influence has waxed and waned. I think in the Sukhothai period, which was like the very early years of the Thai state, when the Thai nation first became independent from the Khmer Empire, as it was, then the king of Sukhothai invited forest monks from the far south of Thailand, in Nakhon Si Thammarat, to come to Sukhothai, and he built a forest monastery for them outside of Sukhothai. And it seems that in that very early days of the Sukhothai period, that the forest monks were given the greatest respect. But then over the coming centuries, then it seemed their influence faded, and in many cases the forest monks seemed to be more known for magic powers and for empowering amulets, and like soldiers and would go to these monks for these amulets that would repel weapons and keep them safe in times of war and so on. But we hear very little about forest teachers as great spiritual masters and so on. As I say, it's hard to be sure whether that's just because we don't have the information or whether they just didn't really exist. But even if the forest tradition had existed in one form or another throughout the whole Ayutthaya period, then what I think is definitely new with Ajahn Mun was the twin emphasis, one on meditation practice, and secondly on the monk's discipline. Before that, as far as I know, the forest monks didn't make much of study of the monk's discipline, and apart from anything else, they didn't have the texts, they didn't have the books. But then there was a very important development in the mid-19th century. Now, if you remember, the second king, called Rajakan, saying he had two sons who both had a good claim to the throne, and unexpectedly, who became the third king was chosen, and then his brother Mongkut, who had expected to become the king, entered the monastic order, became a monk, and he stayed as a monk for the whole duration of his brother's reign. And when his brother died, then he left the monastery and became the fourth king, famous King Mongkut. Now, while he was a monk, he started off in a meditation monastery. This was common in members of the royal family when they became monks for a short period, because it wasn't really long enough to study the texts in any great detail. They would usually go into the monasteries that stress meditation more. But he felt that it was a lot of mumbo-jumbo and superstition, and maybe it was because he didn't have much success in meditation himself. It's hard to say. But he left that and he went to stay in Wat Mahathat. But then again, seeing the general standards of the monks, he was very disillusioned and disappointed, and he felt that the monastic order was in a state of real decline and decay. And so he was determined to try to do something about it. Now he came across a group of monks of the Mon tradition. These are the Mon people who these days mainly living in Burma, but we're also living along the western borders of Thailand and on the western banks of Chah River. And he believed, again it was a matter of belief, he believed that the Mon monks were purer, that they were more they were closer to the Buddha's teachings, their way of life, their discipline. Everything was superior to the tradition, the general Thai tradition, which he felt was hopelessly corrupt. So he reordained. He went through the ceremony of entrance into the monastic order, Upasampada, a second time, and adopted their way of dress and many of their habits. And he was, of course, being the brother of the king, he was given a monastery by the king, the Rajaganti Sam. And then like-minded people, many of them aristocrats like himself, started to live with him, and so became a kind of like a reform group within the Sangha at large. Now this was originally very academic, intellectual kind of group, and they were very interested in getting back to the original teachings. So they imported a lot of texts from Sri Lanka, which in those days still very strong in the intellectual tradition. And one of his disciples wrote a Vinaya textbook, a textbook explaining in great detail the monastic discipline and all its clauses. It's kind of like a very complex law book. I mentioned this in a previous point, at a previous point. And that book became the Vinaya or Vinay textbook for the Dhammayut sect. And that was the book that Ajahn Mun studied from when he first ordained. So, but just to go back again to that period in the mid-19th century, that this order grew somewhat. It was very much the kind of the elite. And when King Mongkut left the monastic order and became the king, then he built a lot of monasteries, particularly for this group, this reform group, and he looked at it as a means of reforming the whole of the Thai Sangha, using this group as like spearhead, or the kind of, that's the right word. And he built a number of monasteries, and he looked at Ubon as being the centre for his new group. It wasn't yet an officially recognised sect. There was still a reform group in Ubon, and he built Wat Subat Vanaram, and then a number of other monasteries grew up in Ubon, and they were all of this group, the Dhammayut group. And so now, if you were, by this time, if you were a young man, and you were not just thinking of becoming a monk for a short period of time, as I say, just to out of custom and for your parents, but you really wanted to make a go of it and to study and to practice well, then these monasteries would tend to draw the most dedicated people, because the standards were very much higher than other monasteries. Particularly, as I say, the emphasis on the monk's discipline, and also they adopted a number of Tudonga Wat practices. So there was, interestingly enough, at this early period, the Dhammayut was not at all a meditation-oriented group. The two areas was really kind of what we call a Protestant group, trying to go back to the real teachings, and emphasizing the monk's discipline, academic study, and then some of the Tudonga Wat practices like eating out of a bowl, and certain regulations regarding wearing of the robes, and not using money was an important one. So many young men from Ubon were ordaining in this group, and one of these was Ajahn Mun, who was born in a little village right on the close to the banks of Mekong River, right in the eastern part of Ubon province. And he ordained in the monastery in Ubon city, and then he went to live with a kind of eccentric, not eccentric, but quite unusual monk called Ajahn Sao. So one of the distinctive characteristics of the Dhammayut group in Ubon was that there were a number of monks who were very keen on meditation. So and that wasn't really true of the original Dhammayut group in Bangkok. And one of these was Ajahn Sao. So Ajahn Sao was Ajahn Mun's first meditation teacher and mentor. And this was where he, as I say, he imbibed this, what became the distinctive Dhammayut forest monastic style, and one which very much appealed to Ajahn Chah in turn. That's to say, one which stressed one, strict monastic discipline, and secondly, meditation. So before there'd been a lot of meditation, and there'd been groups with the monastic discipline, but this is the first time that at least we know that those two things came together. Until now, we just take it for granted. Oh yeah, the forest monks, the meditators, they're very strict in the discipline. But that wasn't at all, the case before Ajahn Mun, as far as we know. So Ajahn Mun is the great forest monk, and his life story would in itself take hours and hours. And there are, I think, a book, his biography has been translated into English, and it's sort of wonderful stories. But basically, after one of the reasons why he's considered very special is that he was able to train many disciples who in their turn became enlightened and became arahants. But it's very unusual for even great teachers to have even more than one or two enlightened disciples, even that. And yet he had many. I'm not sure of the number, 10, 20, 30, it's hard, who can say. But certainly a remarkable number. It just seemed that kind of like a golden age when there were in the early part of the 20th century in the northeast of Thailand, there seemed to be many beings who had reached that kind of ripeness where their spiritual faculties were they were ready to go that last stage and to realize enlightenment. And Ajahn Mun had the ability to recognize these people and to inspire them, to bring them in, to teach them, and to give them what they needed to fulfill their own spiritual journeys. And then they in their turn became the great monastic teachers and leaders of the forest community in following generations. So Ajahn Mun had many inspiring qualities and his great psychic powers and so on and so forth. But one thing is that he, until he was in his 70s, he never spent 2 consecutive rains retreats, 2 consecutive years in one place. He'd been moving all the time. And apart from his own practice, he always had this ideal of sharing the Dhamma and teaching lay people as well. And so after many years in the northeast of Thailand, mostly up in, although he also was from Ubon originally, he, as I told you, and many of his disciples were, spent a lot of time in the northern part of Isan, the northeast. He went to Chiang Mai for a number of years, and then for the last 8-9 years of his life, he came back to the northeast and settled for the last 6 years of his life in a monastery in Sakonnakhon province. And so, in 1946, which was 3 years before his death, Ajahn Chah in Lopburi heard that he'd come all this way, and actually the great teacher of the age was back in the northeast, up in Sakonnakhon province. So at the end of that rains retreat, he started to walk all the way back and set off back to Ubon first to visit his family before walking up northwards to see Ajahn Man. So Ajahn Chah and his friend set off from Ubon, walking northwards to Tat Panom, the famous stupa on the banks of the Mekong River, and then moving northwest, and finally in the Pupan mountain range came to Buman's monastery. And he says immediately when he walked into the monastery there was something about the atmosphere in the monastery which was really special, and something very kind of powerful feeling. Although he couldn't see anybody in the monastery, it was all very quiet, and but everything was extremely well swept. And I think that if you've never been to a Thai forest monastery, it's the idea of what many people call like a Zen-like sort of simplicity, and everything just very, very well, as you say, just everything in its place, very well swept, just very kind of austere simplicity being the general atmosphere. And so he and his friend were welcomed, and they were shown where to put up their glot, and invited to come and to pay respects to Luang Pu Man in the evening. And they went to the kuti, and this was Ajahn Chah's meeting with Luang Pu Man. And he said that although they'd been walking all day and they were very tired, he just felt just so full of bliss listening to Ajahn Man that he just felt like he was floating in the air. Just so inspiring. And he did take the opportunity to ask a question. And again, interesting, it was a question about the monk's discipline rather than about meditation. At least, as he tells us, that his question was, he's studying these texts, the Pubbasika text and the Visuddhimagga text, and it's just so complicated, and there are so many clauses and exceptions, and he come to feel discouraged. I think it's not something that I can live by. It's not a. It's so complicated, that you can't keep it all in your mind at the same time. So, what's the best way to practice this? And Ajahn Man said that, Luang Pu Man said that there are two basic principles underlying the monk's discipline, and one is hiri and one is ottappa. Okay? And if you keep these two principles, then everything else will just come naturally. So hiri is we can translate it as like intelligent shame, and ottappa means fear of the results of unwholesome actions. Maybe I'll just explain those a little bit. Shame doesn't have such a good name in the West these days, and but I think that let me see. Why I call it intelligent shame is it arises from reflecting on your duties, your responsibilities, what your ideals, your aspirations, to the extent that those become very clear to you. What is your duties as a Buddhist, or as in a family life, as a son, or as a father, or as a husband, and so on. You have when you reflect on those, and you have very, very clearly defined standards for yourself, then if you contemplate acting or speaking in such a way that conflicts with those, then the feeling that arises from recognizing that conflict is we call hiri, or intelligent shame. So it's a feeling that arises, but it arises because of a wise understanding of conventional realities, and of precepts and of responsibilities and aspirations, as I say. The other point of ottappa, fear, that's a feeling again, but it arises from reflecting on the law of karma and how unwholesome actions based on greed, hatred and delusion inevitably lead to pain and suffering for yourself and others. And so being able to stop and to recognize the consequences of one's actions and the suffering that will arise from acting and speaking in certain ways gives rise to this kind of fear. So if we say shame and fear, then people, do I want to be someone who feels ashamed and fearful all the time? It doesn't sound like something that you want to develop in yourself. But when you see that these are emotional responses rising from wise reflection, then I think maybe a little bit clearer. So Ajahn Chah spent altogether 3 days with Ajahn Mun only, but on the second night he had teachings on meditation, and particularly on the nature of the mind, which were extremely important, significant to him. And one of his teachings is that Ajahn Mun stressed the importance of seeing the difference between the mind, the sense of knowing, the awareness, and mental states, or we call arom, and to see that mental states are not who you are, that they arise, they pass away according to causes and conditions, and that they can be experienced when as separate, as alien to the mind itself, when the mind has been developed through the training. And that way of looking at the mind and looking at experience, I don't know whether it was the first time with Ajahn Chah, maybe not, but it got through to him and affected him in a way that he never had before. I think this is one of the benefits of hearing the Dhamma from a teacher who's actually realized it rather than someone who's just remembered it, that even his words, even if they resemble or even repeat things you've heard before, it's the same but it's different, and it just goes so much deeper and can affect you in a way that you never forget for the rest of your life. And this is what happened for Ajahn Chah on that night. So he left after 3 days. Well, you might think, why did he leave so soon? There's a verse in the Dhammapada about the tongue recognizing the taste of the soup straight away. You don't have to eat bowls and bowls of soup before you know the taste. And he was saying, he said it's like if you've got your eyes open, you can see something. If your eyes closed, if you're blind, no matter how long you're in the presence of something beautiful, you don't see it. So he didn't think that he really needed any more. And that was very much Ajahn Chah's way. He wasn't someone who liked to stay with teachers for a long time and ask a lot of questions. He was someone who liked to listen, to observe, and to absorb, and then go away and take it away and reflect on it and practice accordingly. And I think that also in a way affected his style of teaching himself, that he would always be instructing his own pupils to not just to expect to be spoon-fed the teachings all the time, but really to be looking and learning and observing and taking what you do here and take it away and develop it, reflect on it.
How many years or how many pansa by the time that Ajahn Chah met Luang Pu Man at this time?
So that would have been after his eighth pansa, I think. So another aspect here, without getting into too much technical detail, is that I told you that Ajahn Mun had ordained into the Dhamma sect. So that reform group established by King Mongkut had over the course of time become a sect. So the monastic order is two sects, the Mahanikaya sect and the Dhamma sect. The Dhamma sect being much smaller, only about a tenth of the size of the Mahanikaya, but always have been very powerful because of its background and its just generally elite nature. And Ajahn Chah had been ordained in the Mahanikaya sect. Now many of the monks who became Ajahn Mun's disciples had, just like him, become monks in the village monasteries of northeast Thailand, which were almost all of them Mahanikaya monasteries. But many of them chose to reordain or to take Upasampada a second time and become Dhammayut monks, to change their sect, to really emphasize the fact that they left that village monastery behind and to fully express their devotion to Ajahn Mun as their teacher. Also certain Sangha Kamma or functions and ceremonies of Sangha could not be attended by the Mahanikaya monks, that the Dhammayut monks would not let the Mahanikaya monks attend these because originally it was on the point that they felt that their sila and their standard of vinaya wasn't sufficiently pure. Subsequently they said that it was because they were of a different sect, and so maybe don't need to go into all of this, but the point being that Ajahn Chah visited Ajahn Mun's monastery as a monk of another sect. And so there was a certain amount of pressure on him or encouragement for him to change sect and to become a Dhammayut monk. And so by that to express his devotion to the Ajahn Mun and to this new kind of forest monasticism. But he chose not to. And as I say, he left after 3 days, and he stayed loyal to the Mahanikaya sect. And in fact, subsequently, he and a small number of other monks became responsible for revitalizing the Mahanikaya sect and introducing this stricter kind of forest monasticism, the same kind of general style and tenor as the Dhammayut style, as the Dhammayut sect, but in the Mahanikaya order. So this is maybe a little bit abstruse for most people, but if you have some interest in Thai Buddhism as a whole, it's quite an important point historically. So anyway, Ajahn Chah left Ajahn Mun, and he had a lot to think about and to meditate on, and then he carried on the Tudong, walking through the northern part of northeast Thailand. He had one experience where he was in his glot in the forest, and these wild dogs came, and very frightening, because he just got a thin cotton curtain between you and all these very fierce wild dogs. But again, they're of taking refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, and then making this vow. If I've created bad karma, if I've ever hurt you, any of you, or killed, or in a past life, then take my life. If you've not, then please leave me alone. This is kind of a way of facing up to these kinds of fears and dangers that he and many forest monks will adopt. That they're sort of putting your life on the line and saying, yes, I'm willing to die if I've done anything in the past which is a karmic debt that I have to pay off, and otherwise then please leave me alone. So Ajahn Chah continued with his Tudong walk, and at one point he decided to go and put up his blot and to spend the night in a cremation ground. Yeah, and in those days there would be, or even these days, there are patches of forest, usually about 1 kilometre or so outside the village, which will be used for cremations. And so there's a ready supply of wood, and it's not too far away to carry the body to the forest, but far enough away that people don't have to worry about the spirits and the ghosts and so on. And because it's, let's say, like a convenient distance from the village, it's quiet, then it's a common place for monks to go and to meditate. In fact, many monasteries are built on cremation grounds, and this is where what Nanachat was built also. That's on the Bungwai village cremation forest originally. Another reason why some monks like to go and to stay in these forests is that it's commonly felt that one of the most important practices is the practice of confronting and overcoming fear. Now, for most people in Thailand, as you know, one of the strongest and overpowering fears is that of spirits and ghosts. Even sophisticated city people like yourselves still have some fear of ghosts, I think. Yes. So it is a kind of, especially in those days, like 60, 70 years ago, one of the most powerful kind of fears. And so monks like to go into fearful places, not just to sort of show off or for sort of macho reasons, but one, they say, because it means that your mind is very sharp and very keen and very awake. You're certainly not going to get sleepy if you're in a place where you feel afraid of wild animals or of spirits and ghosts. And secondly, that fear illuminate or exposes that sense of self and atta, really more than anything else. And so it's very useful experience, one in which you can really see that grasping at the sense of self and existence. Also, to overcome fear in that way is incredibly liberating. It gives rise to great bliss and spiritual joy, and can lead to very deep meditation. As all fears really seem to spring from the fear of death, and death of who we think we are, of ourselves, then overcoming fear in this way can undermine the fear of death also. So for many reasons, monks like to face up to fear. So for Ajahn Chah himself, for him the big fear was of spirits and ghosts. And so he had to really force himself to go and stay in this cremation ground. He said, I didn't want to do it. I really didn't want to do it, but I made myself. And as it so happens that the night he went to stay in the forest, the evening, they brought a body in to the cremation forest and cremated it. So everyone, after the cremation, everybody went back. So he's there. It's not just a forest where they have cremations every now and again. It's one where there's been a cremation, right very close by him. And so that night he experienced an incredibly intense fear and didn't sleep a wink and struggling all through the night. It was very, very difficult for him. But he got through the night and he went on arms round and dogs started to bite him and say, what's going on. He went back for a second night, and of course during the day you think, I'm through the worst of that now and it's going to be all right. The second night they brought in another body and they cremated it really close to where he was staying. And as soon as it got dark, the whole thing started again. And he was sitting in his glot, as I remember, and his eyes closed. The thing about these glots, as I told you, you have this very thin cloth surrounding, but somehow it just makes you feel safe. But anyway, he did have that kind of protection, although it was just an illusory one, really. And then late at night, he suddenly started hearing this crook, crack, crook, and this sound of somebody. It wasn't like an ordinary human being, almost like an animal, but walking on two legs, just walking slowly towards him. And he could hear the leaves rustling at his feet. And he just closes his eyes. Whatever happens, I'm not going to open my eyes. And this thing just walked closer and closer and came up behind him, and then walked off again. And then it came back a second time. And he said he's just so tense. He said he felt like a drum, he's tense as a drum, and he said the fear just increased and just such an intensity that he'd never experienced before. And then it suddenly reached like the sort of the maximum. And then into his mind, he was, what are you afraid of? What are you really afraid of? We're afraid of death. Well, where is death? And so this is very common. This in his practice, that in times of crisis, these kind of thoughts would come up in his mind, almost like a dialogue, And so you're afraid. Well, where is death? And then the answer just popped in his mind: is death lies within. And there's nowhere wherever you go, you take death with you. And although that might seem an obvious point, but at that particular time and at that particular intensity of emotion, he said something just flipped over at that moment, and his fear just disappeared. And at the moment that his fear disappeared, this incredible rush of bliss and his meditation after that was just wonderful. Very strong meditation. And then later, very late, just before dawn, it started to rain. And he said he'd be feeling a little bit sorry for himself now. He said, "Well, here I'm all alone in the rain, and nobody knows who I am and where I am, and also feeling that nobody sort of snug in the house could have any idea of the sort of things that a monk goes through, the experiences of a monk." So he woke up. He had some rest. He woke up. He said, when I woke up, everything was yellow, and he sort of felt really strange. And he went to urinate, and came out with blood. It was just like big gobs of blood coming out in his urine. And so one part of his mind is saying, "This is really dangerous. You've done something serious. You need to see a doctor." And another part of his mind says, "Whatever happens, happens." He said, "If I die, I die. And couldn't think of a better way to die. Die as a monk. Die practicing Dhamma." And so again, he had this kind of to and fro in his mind between this sort of fear and worry, and then, but the power of the Dhamma was much stronger. And said, if I die, I die. This is what I've got to do. And that was an experience in which he went right into fear. And he went right out through the other side. This is something he stressed over and over again. All kinds of dukkha. You can't escape from dukkha by turning your back on it, running. Mm. You know, it's not you want to make yourself suffer, and the more you suffer, the better. But there are certain things that you have to stand up and you have to look at them and go into them, and then they reach a certain point, and then you can come out the other side, and then you know that thing has an end. That thing is not who you are, and it's not something that will ever be able to overpower you in the same way again.